Hey, this is Mrs. Reichelt, and we are now in cell respiration. So we're in the muscle unit, and we're really talking about how does how do muscle fibers get the energy to actually go through and contract. So there are three different ways here. We have direct phosphorylation, okay? We have aerobic respiration, and we have anaerobic respiration. So hopefully from biology you remember some of these. At least I know, if you had me before, you know about aerobic respiration, and I know you don't love it, but hopefully the more times we go through it, it'll actually make a little bit more sense. So direct phosphorylation means that, well, first of all, let's go back here. Phosphorylation means that you are adding a phosphate group. Okay, so that means you're directly going from ADP, okay, adenosine diphosphate. You're adding a phosphate to get ATP. Okay, so it's happening directly. Phosphorylation just means that you're adding a phosphate. Aerobic respiration means that oxygen is going to be used, and then anaerobic respiration means that you don't have oxygen to use. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So our example of direct phosphorylation is we can use a supplement called creatine phosphate, or CP. So basically, muscle cells can store creatine phosphate, and creatine phosphate is a high energy molecule that some sprinters take before an event or something like that. And creatine phosphate is found in muscle fiber only. So, what runners can do is right before their event, they can go ahead and take a creatine phosphate supplement. The only problem is it lasts less than 15 seconds, but you only have between 4 to 6 seconds of ATP that's supplied in each fiber. So that's not really a whole lot of stored ATP. So that means after the 4 to 6 seconds of ATP use, then the body could, if you have a creatine supplement here, your body could go and get an additional 15 seconds worth of ATP. And how that happens is you have ADP, you add creatine phosphate, and you get ATP, because this P is added here, turns it into triphosphate, and then you have your leftover creatine. So after the ATP is depleted, ADP is left over, and then creatine phosphate transfers the energy from ADP to regenerate ATP. Um, so most people, or most students at least, have been trained to know that creatine's not very good for you and that sort of thing. Well, really, when athletic trainers and people talk about creatine phosphate, the reason that they say you have to use it sparingly is because these creatine molecules have to have a way to get out of your cells. So it takes a little while for those to get broken down, because they're not going to be broken down immediately. They're going to have to be flushed out of your system. So here's how this actually goes and works. So you have creatine phosphate, you have ADP. This phosphate gets transferred over here, and the creatine is what's left. So the energy source is creatine phosphate. You don't need oxygen, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So what that means is for every 1 creatine phosphate, you get 1 ATP. Problem is, it only lasts for about 15 seconds. Next up here, we have aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration is when we use glucose, or C6H12O6. Okay, so we use glucose, and we break that down into carbon dioxide and water. Meanwhile, we release ATP. So it's releasing energy, and there are 3 major steps to aerobic respiration. I guess I wrote my PowerPoint wrong. So the steps that are included are glycolysis is step 1, the Krebs cycle is step 2, And then the electron transport chain is step 3. So the major things to take away about aerobic respiration is that this is a slower reaction, but it also requires continuous amount of oxygen. Even though it occurs slowly, it is going to get the biggest bang for the buck. Okay, you're going to produce a lot more ATP in aerobic circumstances rather than the anaerobic circumstances. And then the series of metabolic pathways that occur in the mitochondria are known as oxidative phosphorylation. So, really, what that means is that if you look at glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, you're going to phosphorylate. And what does phosphorylate mean again? Adding a phosphate. So you're going to add phosphates by using different types of redox reactions. And if you don't know what a redox reaction is, don't worry about that word. It's really just you're going to have a whole bunch of different chemical reactions that are going to take place. Chemical reactions in glycolysis and in Krebs cycle and etc. And collectively, the whole purpose of that is when you add ADP and phosphorylate ADP to eventually make ATP, that whole process is oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so glycolysis is the first step here, and this is the one we're really going to focus on because glycolysis occurs without using oxygen. So I'm just going to put no oxygen needed. Also, here's another big thing that I didn't write down. I wasn't paying attention when I was making this PowerPoint. Glycolysis occurs in aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So, when glycolysis appears in aerobic respiration, once you go through glycolysis, then you move into the Krebs cycle. However, in fermentation or anaerobic respiration, this is the only step there is. You just have glycolysis. So we're still talking about aerobic circumstances. So let's ignore the anaerobic for now, but just be aware that anaerobic is also undergoes glycolysis. So in glycolysis, glucose or C6H12O6 is broken down into a molecule of pyruvic acid, and it's really two pyruvic acids, but and this also occurs in the cytosol or the cytoplasm. And for every 2 ATP molecules, you make you use 1 glucose. Okay, so in glycolysis, you're going to make 2 ATP for every 1 glucose that you're breaking down. Okay, so here's the steps here of aerobic respiration. We are going to start with glucose. You get a tiny little bit of ATP, you get pyruvic acid, then you go into the mitochondria. The mitochondria is going to do a couple things. You're going to have the Krebs cycle that takes place in there. You're also going to have the electron transport chain, and as a result, you're going to get carbon dioxide as a byproduct, oxygen as a byproduct, and this is oxygen. Oh man, you're going to get water as a byproduct, and this is not like the water that you would intake. This is metabolic water. And then the last thing is you're going to get a whole bunch of ATP. So again, this is oxidative phosphorylation, and it's going to produce between 36 to 38 ATP. Let's see. So, I guess the product should read, well, I guess 32 would be if we're just looking at the ETC by itself, but if this is okay, if we're looking at the entire thing, including glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and ETC, we're going to have between 36 and 38 ATP produced. Okay, so in anaerobic respiration, so we're moving to the third one. So remember, the first one we talked about was the direct phosphorylation or creatine phosphate. Second one was aerobic. Now we're moving into anaerobic respiration. So, anaerobic respiration, the first step is glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis converts glucose. You already wrote this down, so if you don't want to write this again, that's okay. To pyruvic acid. Okay, then the pyruvic acid gets converted to lactic acid, and you're going to only make 2 ATP molecules this way. So this reaction is not as efficient, but it occurs very quickly. The reason it occurs quickly is because you don't have to go through the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain. One of the things is you're going to use a whole bunch of glucose, and then lactic acid produces muscle fatigue. However, your book, I don't know exactly when your book was published. I think it was published in 2011 or 2012. But what they've come out with since then is that there's new studies proving that, or disproving that lactic acid produces or causes muscle fatigue. They're now thinking that it's a potassium that's actually causing muscle fatigue, and lactic acid, they're saying, is actually really beneficial and helps your muscles become better and become stronger. But it's the potassium that builds up in each muscle cell that actually causes that fatigue. So your book is out of date, and so is your PowerPoint. So lactic acid is really beneficial, is what they're finding, and it's that potassium which is giving the effects of that muscle fatigue. So this is going to provide enough ATP for 30 to 40 seconds of strenuous activity. Okay, so if we look here, we start with glycogen, or actually we could even start with glucose. It doesn't really matter. So if we start with glucose, you get a little bit of ATP, 2 of them actually, and then you go from pyruvic acid to lactic acid. So your source is glucose, and it's a 2-to-1 ratio.